He expected a blind date that could change his life. Instead, he was left alone, humiliated, with nothing but silence across the table. But sometimes, the person who truly belongs in your life isn't the one you're waiting for. It's the one who chooses to show up. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. It's always amazing to see the places these stories travel. The table was set for two. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath the glow of chandeliers, catching fragments of golden light. But only one chair was filled. Ethan Cross sat in silence. 32 years old, polished, powerful, the kind of man whose presence usually commanded a room. Yet here, in the middle of a crowded restaurant, he looked small, alone. Across from him, the empty seat became heavier with every passing minute. It was more than just an absence. It was a mirror reflecting everything he tried to keep hidden. Loneliness, doubt, the ache of a man who seemed to have everything, yet quietly feared he had nothing that mattered. He wasn't waiting only for a blind date. He was waiting for hope. Waiting for proof that his life could be more than endless meetings, sleepless nights, an empire that felt colder the bigger it grew. Minutes ticked by. 5, 10, 15, each second louder than the last. The murmur of other diners seemed to sharpen into whispers. Eyes flicked toward him, then away. And beneath his flawless suit, beneath the perfect posture, humiliation pressed down like a weight. The mighty So stood up, but someone else noticed. Someone unexpected. Not the woman he was waiting for. Not a glamorous date in designer silk, but a waitress, weaving between tables, balancing trays, wearing the simple black apron of her trade. Her name was Lila Monroe, and the choice she was about to make, the choice to step toward his table, would not only change the course of Ethan Cross's night, it would change the future of his company and his heart. Ethan Cross was the kind of man headlines adored. A self-made CEO, young, handsome, commanding. Magazine covers praised his vision. Investors admired his instincts, and his employees whispered about his iron focus, his impossible standards. From the outside, he had it all: wealth, power, prestige. But the truth was quieter, hidden behind the glass walls of his skyscraper office. After the meetings ended and the doors closed, Ethan carried something he never admitted to anyone: loneliness. For years, he had traded moments of connection for the chase of ambition. Late nights spent studying balance sheets instead of friendships. Empty penthouses instead of a home. Even his smile, when it appeared, was rehearsed for cameras, never reaching the part of him that ached for something real. He was 32 years old, and the world saw a king. But kings can still be alone on their thrones. And lately, there was something else pressing on Ethan's chest. A secret storm gathering behind the polished surface of success. His company, the empire he built from nothing, was bleeding. Competition was fierce, investors restless, and the numbers he stared at in the dead of night whispered one word he couldn't escape: bankruptcy. He buried it well. No one could know. Not his staff. Not his rivals. Not even the friends who still tried to reach him. Ethan was a man who mastered control, who never allowed cracks to show. But inside, he was running out of time, and he knew it. That was why the blind date mattered. Not for business. Not for power. But because Ethan Cross wanted, for just one night, to believe that life could hold more than strategies and survival. He wanted to believe that somewhere out there was someone who could see him. Not the CEO, not the genius, not the public figure, but the man behind the title. And so, when his friends set him up on this date, he allowed himself a fragile hope, a chance. It was rare for Ethan to step into vulnerability. But tonight, dressed in an immaculate suit and seated at that table for two, he had opened the door just wide enough to let possibility in. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that fate had no intention of sending the woman he expected. Instead, It had placed someone entirely different in his path. Someone the world might overlook, but someone who would see him more clearly than anyone ever had. Lila Monroe was 27, and in many ways, life hadn't been fair to her. She was the kind of woman people notice without quite knowing why. Not because of flashy clothes or expensive perfume. She didn't have those things, but because of her presence. The warmth in her smile, the spark of wit in her eyes, the quiet strength that made even strangers feel at ease. By day, she carried plates and poured coffee, weaving through crowded tables with practiced grace. To most who sat at those tables, she was simply the waitress, a face in the background, someone they would forget by morning. But Lila was far more than the uniform she wore. She had once dreamed of bigger things. She had studied business in college, hungry to build a future where she could create, lead, and change lives. Her professors admired her sharp mind, her ability to see solutions where others only saw problems. She was meant for boardrooms, not break rooms. For strategy sessions, not late-night shifts. But life has a way of rewriting dreams. Her father's illness had drained the family savings. Her younger brother needed help finishing school. And so, when bills piled up, Lila made a choice. She traded textbooks for a tray, boardrooms for a cafe. Dreams would have to wait. Family came first. Still, she never let go of who she was. On slow nights, she scribbled ideas on napkins. She studied trends on her phone between shifts. She kept her mind sharp, her spirit alive, even when her body was exhausted. And though she carried struggles most couldn't see, she also carried hope. Hope that one day, somehow, life would open a door she thought had long been closed. For now, she lived in the background, smiling at strangers, overhearing pieces of their lives, quietly watching the world she longed to step into. But fate has a strange sense of timing. On that night, in that restaurant, as she glanced toward the sharply dressed man sitting alone at a table meant for two, Lila couldn't have imagined that the door she had been waiting for was about to swing wide open. The restaurant was alive with chatter, the clink of glasses, the hum of laughter rising like soft music in the background. Couples leaned close across candlelit tables, conversations flowing easily. Waiters glided between chairs, carrying trays balanced with wine and delicate dishes. And at the center of it all, Ethan Cross sat alone. At first, he masked it well. He glanced at his watch, adjusted his cufflinks, sipped from his glass as though his companion were simply late. A small delay, nothing more. But the minutes dragged on. 5, 10, 15. The second hand of his watch ticked like a drumbeat, louder with every rotation. His confidence, so carefully crafted, began to feel fragile. Around him, eyes started to notice. A couple in the corner whispered. A man across the aisle smirked behind his napkin. To them, it was gossip, a curiosity. To Ethan, it was humiliation carved into silence. This was not just a date that hadn't shown up. This was a reminder that no matter how powerful he was in the boardroom, in this moment, he was just another man unwanted. He shifted in his seat, tried to wave away the rise in discomfort, but the truth pressed down harder. Each tick of the clock made the empty chair across from him feel heavier, almost mocking him with its silence. And then something happened. As Ethan lowered his eyes to the untouched menu, a shadow passed his table. A presence lingered for just a heartbeat longer than usual. She noticed him, the waitress. Lila, her steps slowed, her gaze softening as she read the tension in his face, the quiet humiliation he tried so desperately to conceal. Most people would have looked away, pretended not to see. But Lila wasn't most people. She hesitated, tray in hand, caught between duty and instinct. And then, with a courage even she didn't fully understand, she allowed herself to stop. to look directly at the man who seemed untouchable, yet in this moment was achingly human. And in that stillness, a thought flickered in her mind. Maybe, just maybe she could change the story of this night. What Ethan didn't know was that the stranger in the apron, standing a few feet from his table, was about to rewrite his evening and eventually his entire life. Lila set the tray down on a nearby table, her heart racing. She wasn't supposed to do this. Waitresses didn't sit with guests. They didn't blur the line between serving and sharing. But something about Ethan, his silence, his guarded posture, the way his hand lingered too long on the untouched glass, pulled at her. She stepped closer, leaned just enough to catch his attention, and with a gentle smile whispered words that surprised even her. "Be ashamed to let that dinner go cold. Mind if I keep you company?" Ethan blinked, startled. For the first time that evening, the mask of the unshakable CEO slipped. And then, slowly, he nodded. So she sat. At first, the air between them was uncertain. Small talk, light remarks. She teased him about looking far too serious for someone in a place meant for laughter and wine. He countered with a half smile, admitting it wasn't exactly the night he planned. But then something shifted. The conversation stretched beyond pleasantries. Ethan, guarded as ever, let slip fragments of his world. The long hours, the pressure, the way success sometimes felt more like a burden than a blessing. He spoke in vague terms at first, careful not to reveal too much. But Lila listened, not with the polite nods of someone passing time, but with the focus of someone who truly cared. And when he mentioned the cracks in his company, the struggles with competition, the fear of falling behind, he expected her to offer sympathy at best. Instead, she tilted her head, thought for a moment, and spoke with a clarity that startled him. She asked questions, sharp, pointed ones. Why focus so much on one saturated market? Why overlook smaller, emerging trends? Why invest in appearances when innovation was what built loyalty? Each question landed like a stone skipping across water, stirring ripples in his mind. Ethan leaned in. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he felt a spark, not of despair, but of possibility. This woman, this waitress in a simple black apron, saw angles his entire team had missed. Her ideas weren't rehearsed or wrapped in corporate jargon. They were raw, instinctive, and brilliant. And more than that, they came from a place he hadn't felt in a long time: honesty. As the plates between them cooled, as laughter occasionally broke through the weight of their words, Ethan realized something profound. This wasn't just small talk anymore. This was a conversation that mattered. He found himself smiling, not the polished grin he wore for cameras, but something real. And Lila, though she tried to hide it, felt her own heart shift. For years, she had carried her dreams quietly, convinced they were nothing more than memories of a path she could no longer walk. But here, across from a man she barely knew, those dreams found a voice again. The restaurant around them faded. The whispers, the glances, the ticking of the clock, all of it disappeared. For a moment, there was only him and her, and the realization that this chance encounter was no accident. What began as a rescue from humiliation was becoming something neither of them could have expected. A spark, not just between two people, but a spark that might ignite the future of an entire company. Ethan Cross had sat at countless tables in his life. Dinner with investors, lunches with clients, negotiations that stretched late into the night, conversations that were all about leverage, profit, survival. But this was different. Across from him sat a woman who didn't care about his title or his money or the carefully constructed image that had carried him this far. Lila spoke to him as if he were simply a man who could listen, a man who could learn, And for the first time in years, Ethan felt himself leaning forward, not to command the conversation, but to stay in it. Her words stirred something in him. Each insight, each question, each flash of humor was like oxygen to a fire he thought had burned out long ago. Where his board saw problems, Lila saw possibilities. Where others drowned in spreadsheets, she painted pictures of what could be. And beyond the brilliance of her ideas, there was something else. It was the way she laughed, freely, without calculation. The way her eyes lit up when she made a point she truly believed in. The way she seemed utterly unafraid to tell the truth, even to a man who could have dismissed her with a wave of his hand. That honesty had disarmed him. The weight he carried, the pressure of running an empire on the edge of collapse, suddenly felt lighter, not gone, not solved, but shared, even if only for a moment. Ethan found himself smiling, really smiling, as if the armor he wore every day had finally cracked. And Lila, though she tried to hide it, felt her own heart race at the realization. This wasn't just a conversation. This was a connection. Two people from completely different worlds. A CEO and a waitress. But in that moment, the labels dissolved. There was only curiosity, laughter, and the undeniable spark of something new taking shape. Ethan had come to dinner expecting disappointment. Instead, he discovered possibility, not just for his company, but for himself. And though neither of them dared to say it out loud, both could feel it. Something was shifting, something rare, something neither of them had been searching for, yet both desperately needed. What began as a rescue from loneliness was now the beginning of a story that neither Ethan Cross nor Lila Monroe could have written alone. The night had stretched longer than either of them expected. Plates cleared, glasses nearly empty, yet neither Ethan nor Lila seemed ready to leave the table. What had started as small talk had become something deeper, a rhythm, a flow, an energy that neither of them could deny. Ethan sat back, studying her, not with the detached calculation of a businessman, but with the quiet realization that he was seeing something rare, a mind that challenged him, a perspective that cut through the noise he had been drowning in. And then a thought struck him, reckless, unorthodox, the kind of thought a man like Ethan Cross was never supposed to entertain. What if she wasn't just a spark in the night? What if her voice could be the key his company desperately needed? He hesitated, torn between instinct and caution. Inviting a waitress into his world, into his boardroom, it bordered on madness. His investors would laugh. His employees would sneer. The media would have a field day. But as he looked into her eyes, clear, confident, unshaken by his title, Ethan made a choice. With a slow breath, he leaned forward. His voice softened, but his words carried weight. He asked her to come, to sit with his team, to share the ideas she had so casually offered tonight, but in a room where they could actually change the future. For a moment, Lila thought he was joking. A CEO, one of the most powerful men in the city, inviting her, a waitress, into the inner circle of his company? It sounded impossible. But the look in his eyes told her he meant every word. Her heart raced. Doubt clawed at her. She didn't belong in glass towers or executive meetings. She belonged here, weaving between tables, unnoticed. Didn't she? And yet, deep down, a quiet voice answered back. She had belonged once. She had studied, dreamed, prepared for a life bigger than this. Maybe she had been forced to set those dreams aside, but they were still hers, still alive. After a long pause, she gave the smallest of nods. Not a promise, not a guarantee, but a yes to possibility. In that moment, the risk was sealed. Ethan Cross had placed his faith not in his board, not in the consultants, but in the woman fate had dropped at his table. And Lila Monroe had agreed to step into a world that would test not just her ideas, but her very sense of belonging. Neither of them could know it yet, But this invitation, this single reckless leap, was about to change everything. The boardroom was a world away from the warm glow of the restaurant. Cold glass walls, polished steel, faces lined with skepticism. Ethan Cross had walked into this room many times before, always in command, always unchallenged. But today, all eyes followed the woman at his side. Lila Monroe, a waitress, an outsider. She felt their stares before a word was spoken. A dozen tailored suits. Men and women who had built careers in finance, marketing, technology, all of them wondering the same thing. Why was she here? The silence was sharp. And then one of them smirked. Another whispered. The weight of doubt filled the room like smoke. Ethan broke the tension first. He introduced her simply without pretense, his voice steady. She has something worth hearing. And then he gave her the floor. For a heartbeat, Lila froze. Her palms trembled. Every instinct screamed that she didn't belong. But then she remembered the man beside her, the spark of belief in his eyes. And she remembered herself, the woman who once dreamed of boardrooms, not coffee tables. So she spoke, at first softly, cautious. She outlined the flaws she had noticed in their strategy, how they were chasing crowded markets, how they were pouring resources into battles they could never win. A few chuckles slipped from the table. But then her voice grew stronger. She painted a different picture. A pivot, a chance to focus on underserved niches, to harness new technologies before competitors even noticed. She spoke of efficiency, of innovation, of bold moves that didn't rely on the old ways of thinking. And suddenly, the room that had dismissed her began to listen. The smirks faded. The whispers stopped. Pens moved across notepads. Questions were asked, not mocking ones, but serious, searching ones. And to each, Lila answered with clarity, with precision, with the kind of vision they hadn't heard in months. Ethan watched, silent but steady, as her words filled the space. Pride rose in him, not just in her ideas, but in her courage. She wasn't merely holding her ground. She was leading. By the time she finished, the silence was different. No longer heavy with doubt, but charged with possibility. For the first time in a long time, Ethan saw something he'd been searching for, hope. And in that boardroom, where she was never meant to belong, Lila Monroe had just changed everything. The breakthrough should have been a victory. Ethan's team had listened. Investors were beginning to lean in. For the first time in months, the company had a direction that felt alive again. But success always draws whispers. And whispers soon became noise. How could he trust a waitress with billion-dollar decisions? Is this some kind of publicity stunt? She doesn't belong here. The words traveled quickly through office halls, across polished conference tables, spilling into headlines in quiet corners of the press. To the world, Lila was not a visionary. She was a curiosity, a scandal waiting to happen. Inside the company, some scoffed openly, others smiled politely to her face, only to question her in hushed tones afterward. The sharpest ideas in the room were suddenly dismissed, not because they lacked merit, but because of the woman who carried them. And Lila felt it. Every glance, every whisper, every subtle reminder that she was not one of them. She wore no power suit. She had no elite degree framed on an office wall. She wasn't a colleague. They saw her as an intruder. The very place where her brilliance had finally been recognized was now the place where her presence felt like a mistake. Nights grew heavier. She replayed the comments, the stares, the doubt. And slowly, the old fear crept back in. The fear that she had been foolish to believe she could belong in Ethan's world. Ethan tried to shield her, but even he couldn't silence the voices outside those glass walls. The question pressed harder with every day. Would he protect his image or protect her? The world was watching. And so was Lila. waiting to see if the man who had believed in her would stand by her when it mattered most. The ballroom glowed with ambition. Investors, journalists, employees, all gathered beneath crystal chandeliers, waiting for Ethan Cross to speak. Tonight was meant to be a turning point. The company's future hung on his words. But Ethan's mind was not on the charts or the projections waiting on the teleprompter. His mind was on her. Lila. He could see her at the edge of the crowd, standing just beyond the spotlight. Her posture straight, but her eyes heavy with doubt. She didn't belong here. At least that's what the whispers around the room insisted. And he knew this was the moment he could step to the stage and protect his image. Pretend that Lila was never part of the story. Hide the truth behind polished numbers and corporate spin. Or he could choose her. The host introduced him. Applause rose. Ethan walked to the podium, the weight of every stare pressing against him. Cameras flashed. Silence fell. He paused, his hand steady on the microphone. And then, in a voice clear but unshaken, he began. He spoke of the company's struggles, the battles they had faced, the brink of collapse they had stood upon. He admitted, for the first time, that he didn't have all the answers, that even a CEO could be blind. The crowd shifted, uneasy. Vulnerability was not the language of power. But then his words changed. His eyes found hers. And he said, "The truth is, the reason we're standing here today, with a future at all, is because of someone most of you would have overlooked. Someone without a title, without a corner office. Someone who had every reason to stay silent, but instead chose to speak." A ripple moved through the crowd. Faces turned, searching for her. Ethan's voice grew stronger. "She didn't just save this company. She saved me. She reminded me that brilliance isn't defined by resumes or business cards. It's defined by courage. And if you want to know who deserves credit for the future we're building, it's Lila Monroe." The room erupted, not with polite applause, but with shock, disbelief, and something else entirely. Respect. And for Lila, standing in the shadows, a truth pierced through the doubt. He hadn't hidden her. He hadn't protected his image at her expense. He had chosen her. Fully, publicly, without fear. In that moment, Ethan Cross was no longer just a CEO fighting to save a company. He was a man willing to risk everything for the woman who had given him back hope. The applause still echoed when Ethan stepped down from the stage. Cameras flashed, voices swirled, but none of it mattered. His eyes searched only for her. Lila. She stood frozen, caught between disbelief and something deeper. For so long, she had been told she didn't belong, that her dreams were too far, her voice too small. And yet, in front of the entire world, Ethan had shattered every lie she had carried. He walked to her, the crowd parting as if the moment itself demanded it. And when he reached her, there was no title, no distance, just a man and the woman who had changed everything. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Words felt too small for what pulsed between them, but the silence said enough. Gratitude, respect, admiration, and something that had been growing quietly since the night of the empty chair. Love. Ethan took her hand, not as a gesture of charity, but as a declaration, an equal, a partner, someone he didn't just want beside him in the company, but in his life. And in that simple touch, Lila understood. She didn't have to choose between her dreams and her heart. She had found both here with him. The ballroom faded into a blur. It was no longer CEO and Waitress. No longer two people from different worlds. It was Ethan and Lila, partners in every sense of the word. And as he drew her close, as their lips met in a kiss that silenced the noise around them, a truth settled over them both. They had not just saved the company. They had saved each other. In the end, it was never about the empty chair or the blind date who never came. It was about what was found in its place. Ethan Cross, the man the world believed had everything, discovered that true strength wasn't measured in profits or power, but in the courage to be vulnerable, to listen, and to love. And Lila Monroe, the woman the world overlooked, proved that brilliance doesn't need a title or a corner office or polished shoes to shine. Sometimes it lives quietly, waiting for the right moment to be seen. Together, they learn a truth the world often forgets. Appearances deceive. A suit can hide loneliness. An apron can hide genius. What matters isn't the role we play, but the heart we carry. And sometimes life's greatest heartbreaks, the rejection, the humiliation, the night that seemed ruined, are nothing more than doorways. Doorways to something better, something truer. For Ethan, it was salvation. For Lila, it was belonging. For both, it was love. And as they stepped forward, no longer CEO and Waitress, no longer worlds apart, but partners, the lesson remained clear. Worth is not defined by where you start. It is revealed by the courage to show up, to speak, to risk, because the people who change our lives often arrive when we least expect them. Sometimes, not at all who we were waiting for, but exactly who we needed. And so, what began as a lonely night at an empty table became the start of something extraordinary. Proof that sometimes the people who change our lives are the ones we never expected. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe and join me here on Heartfelt Tales TV, where every story reminds us of the power of love, courage, and second chances.